It was an ordinary morning in the bustling heart of the city. The sun shone through the large glass windows of the corporate building, casting a warm glow on the marble floors. The air was filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and distant chatter as employees rushed to start their day. Among them was a man who stood out not just for his appearance, but for his position. Dressed in a sleek, tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that matched his commanding presence, he walked with an air of confidence. This was a man who had built a successful empire, a black CEO who had worked his way from the bottom to become one of the most powerful leaders in the industry. Today, he was here to discuss a potential partnership that could take his company to new heights. As he walked into the gleaming lobby, his assistant by his side, he glanced around at the modern architecture, the polished furniture, and the ever-so-expensive decor. This was a company that valued success, and it showed. He had heard so much about this place. But this was his first visit. His anticipation was high. He had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, ensuring that every detail was perfect. This could be the breakthrough he needed. The receptionist sat behind her desk, typing away on her computer. She was focused on her work, eyes glued to the screen as though she had no care for the world around her. The CEO approached the counter with a friendly smile, ready to introduce himself. But as he got closer, he noticed the receptionist didn't even glance up at him. "Good morning," he said politely, his voice calm and confident. The receptionist didn't respond immediately, continuing her typing with apparent disinterest. Finally, after a few seconds, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "I'm here to meet with the CEO of your company," he replied, still smiling. "I have an appointment." She narrowed her eyes for a moment, her gaze lingering on his face. "Name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan Mitchell," he replied, giving her his full name. "I'm the CEO of Mitchell Enterprises." At the mention of his name, the receptionist's eyebrows twitched ever so slightly. She looked down at her computer screen, typing a few words before her fingers paused. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence between them. Jonathan could feel his patience wearing thin. He had never been treated this way before. It wasn't common for people to ignore him, let alone act so dismissively. "Just a moment," she said abruptly, turning her attention back to her screen. Jonathan stood there, feeling increasingly out of place in the lavish lobby. His assistant, standing quietly beside him, exchanged a puzzled glance with him, but they said nothing. Minutes ticked by. The receptionist didn't say another word. She simply continued to stare at her computer screen, as if Jonathan wasn't even standing there. He felt a sense of unease wash over him. Something didn't feel right. Was she truly unaware of who he was? Could it be that she had mistaken him for someone else? Surely, someone like him would be recognized, especially in a place like this. After several minutes of silence, Jonathan cleared his throat, trying to remain calm. "Excuse me, I really do need to speak with the CEO. I'm not sure what the delay is, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist." The receptionist finally looked up again, her face showing a flicker of annoyance. "I said, wait outside," she replied curtly, her tone sharp. Jonathan blinked, stunned. His mind raced. Was this a joke? Was he being disrespected? The receptionist's cold demeanor suggested she was in no hurry to rectify the situation. She didn't even offer him the common courtesy of guiding him to a waiting area, nor did she apologize for the confusion. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You heard me," the receptionist snapped, her face hardening. "You need to wait outside. Someone will come to get you soon." The nerve. Jonathan stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. His mind was spinning with questions. What kind of behavior was this? How could anyone be treated like this? He glanced around the lobby at the other employees passing by. None of them seemed to notice or care about what was happening. This wasn't just a simple mistake or miscommunication. This was something else entirely. Jonathan couldn't believe it, but he knew one thing for certain. Something was off here, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. His patience, once so steady, was now starting to thin. What had started as a promising day was rapidly turning into something much darker. Jonathan Mitchell stood in stunned silence, his mind racing as the receptionist's cold words echoed in his ears. Wait outside. He had never been treated like this before, not even close. He was the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the industry, yet here he was, being told to wait outside like a nobody. His hand instinctively tightened around the leather strap of his briefcase as he processed what had just happened. Was this a mistake? Was she just having a bad day? Or was there something more to this than he was willing to admit? The receptionist, a middle-aged woman in her late 40s, was still typing away at her computer, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. Her face was a mask of indifference, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Jonathan's assistant stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to react. His eyes flicked nervously between Jonathan and the receptionist, but he remained silent. Jonathan's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had been in countless high-powered meetings across the globe, dealing with billion-dollar deals, corporate mergers, and people from all walks of life. But never had he been made to feel so insignificant. Something about this felt wrong, deep down in his gut. He knew this wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. This was deliberate. For a moment, Jonathan considered walking out. He thought about leaving and calling it a day, perhaps rescheduling the meeting with the CEO of this company. But as his gaze lingered on the receptionist, something stopped him. His mind flashed to the countless times he had fought for his place in the corporate world. He had worked harder than most, endured hardships, and faced obstacles that many people couldn't even imagine. To walk away now would be to let this woman, this receptionist, win. But Jonathan was not the type to back down. He never had been. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't think you understand who I am. I'm Jonathan Mitchell. I'm the CEO of Mitchell Enterprises. I have an appointment with your CEO today." The receptionist didn't even flinch. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes scanning him with a look of mild disinterest before returning to her computer screen. Her fingers clicked away at the keyboard, seemingly oblivious to the fact that Jonathan had just addressed her directly. Jonathan's heart raced as he felt his frustration boiling up. He had made sure to dress impeccably, to walk with authority, to speak clearly and confidently. He had done everything by the book. Yet here he was, being dismissed by a woman who barely even acknowledged him. He thought back to his earlier interactions with other employees in the lobby. They hadn't even looked his way. They hadn't even taken a moment to smile or say hello. It was as if he didn't exist. His assistant leaned over and whispered softly, "Maybe she just doesn't recognize you." But Jonathan knew that wasn't it. It wasn't that she didn't recognize him. It was that she didn't care who he was. And that realization hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't about his reputation or the power he held. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained, something that had less to do with him personally and more to do with the culture of this company, and perhaps even society as a whole. Jonathan's mind flashed at the many times he had been underestimated because of his race. He had always fought against those who doubted him, proving time and time again that he was more than capable, more than deserving of his success. But this felt different. This wasn't just a random act of disrespect. This was a symptom of something much bigger. "Why don't you just leave, Jonathan?" His inner voice urged. "Why subject yourself to this nonsense? You don't need this. You have power. You have control. Just walk away." But Jonathan stood his ground. He had faced discrimination and prejudice before, but he had never let it define him. He was more than capable of handling this situation. He had built his empire on resilience, strength, and unshakable determination. He wasn't about to let this one moment break him. "No," he whispered to himself, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about me. It's about the bigger picture. As he stood there in the sterile lobby, Jonathan realized that this wasn't just a personal affront. It was an indication of a much deeper problem within this company. Something told him that this receptionist's dismissive behavior wasn't an isolated incident. He wondered how many others had been treated like this before, how many others had felt the sting of being overlooked or devalued. He felt a sudden surge of anger. Anger not just at the receptionist, but at the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist unchecked. The receptionist finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she seemed to register his presence. But rather than offering an apology or a solution, she simply waved her hand dismissively toward the door. "Wait outside," she repeated, her tone colder than before. Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind now fully clear. This was more than just a bad encounter. It was a message, and he was going to make sure that the people who ran this company heard that message loud and clear. The time for playing by the rules was over. Something needed to change, and he was the one who was going to make it happen. With one final glance at the receptionist, Jonathan turned around and walked toward the door, a plan forming in his mind. He had been given a small taste of what this company truly was, and it wasn't good. But now, it was time to take action. Jonathan Mitchell was done waiting. His initial shock and confusion had given way to a quiet, simmering anger. The situation was no longer just about the receptionist's disrespect. It had become about something bigger. A system that allowed people like him to be overlooked, dismissed, and humiliated. He had fought too hard, climbed too many mountains, to be treated like this. And now, it was time to make his voice heard. He turned sharply, the heels of his polished shoes clicking decisively against the marble floor. His assistant looked at him, wide-eyed, but Jonathan gave him a brief, reassuring nod. There was no backing down now. He had come here for a reason, and he wasn't going to let a single person, no matter their position, derail that. The receptionist, oblivious to his internal turmoil, was still focused on her computer screen, typing away as though nothing had happened. Her lack of concern only fueled his determination. He was about to do something that would not only change the course of his day, but could potentially change everything for this company. He was going to confront her directly. No more games. No more pretending this was just a misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice firm but controlled. He walked back to the counter where the receptionist sat, standing tall in front of her. "I don't think you understand who I am. I'm Jonathan Mitchell, the CEO of Mitchell Enterprises. I have an appointment with your CEO today, and I demand to speak with someone who can help me." The receptionist's fingers paused over her keyboard, but she didn't look up. Her indifference was infuriating. Jonathan's patience, already tested by the morning's events, was nearing its breaking point. "Please, step aside," she said, her voice flat. "I told you, wait outside. Someone will be with you shortly." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down now, not when he was so close to exposing the deeper problem in this company. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers, his gaze unwavering. "No," he replied, his tone quiet but heavy with resolve. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to someone in charge. Your treatment of me is unacceptable, and I'm not going to sit idly by while this happens. I'm not just some visitor you can dismiss without a second thought. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, and I demand the respect that comes with that." For the first time, the receptionist looked up at him. Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise with a cold expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jonathan raised his hand, cutting her off. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet authority. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again. To anyone. The way you're treating me, the way you're treating people in this company. It's wrong. And it's time someone said something." The tension in the air grew thick. Employees had begun to notice the commotion, some stopping in their tracks to watch the confrontation unfold. Jonathan could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing this for every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or insignificant by a system that failed to recognize their worth. "I want to speak to your CEO now," Jonathan said, his voice growing more insistent. "If I'm not given the respect I deserve, I will leave. But mark my words, I will not leave quietly. I'll make sure the whole world knows what happens here. I will make sure you're held accountable for your actions." The receptionist's composure was cracking. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked around the office, as if searching for someone to help her, but no one came. The employees who had gathered at the edge of the lobby were still watching, but no one moved to intervene. Jonathan's stance was unwavering, his eyes sharp and focused. "Now," he added, "I don't care if you have to call security. I don't care if I have to go to the highest level of authority in this company. But I will not stand for this kind of disrespect. Not here, not today, and not ever again." For a moment, there was only silence. The receptionist's fingers twitched nervously, and her expression flickered with uncertainty. Jonathan's words had struck a chord. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't sure how to handle this. It was as if the calm, collected CEO standing before her had thrown her off balance. This wasn't a man she could easily dismiss. This was a leader, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the system and demand change. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I'll call someone," she said, the hint of defeat in her tone. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed. Jonathan stood there, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't going to back down. This was his moment. As the receptionist spoke into the phone, Jonathan knew he had won. It wasn't about the immediate outcome. It was about the principle of standing up for what was right. In that moment, he had made it clear that no one, no matter their position or title, was above the basic decency and respect every person deserved. Jonathan took a deep breath. The hard part was over. Now it was time to see how far the company was willing to go to right the wrongs that had been done. The tension in the lobby was palpable as Jonathan Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, waiting for the receptionist to make the call that would change everything. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as more employees had gathered near the edges of the lobby, whispering among themselves. Some seemed intrigued by the unfolding scene, while others appeared uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. The receptionist, still visibly flustered, clutched the phone with trembling fingers, her eyes flickering nervously between Jonathan and the crowd. "Please hold for a moment," she said, her voice lacking its usual sternness. Jonathan didn't respond, his gaze fixed firmly on her. He was done being polite. He was done being ignored. This was bigger than just one meeting, bigger than one instance of disrespect. It was about sending a message that could be heard by everyone in this company and beyond. The receptionist eventually hung up, her face pale. "Someone will be here shortly," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan didn't reply. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to show that this moment was far from over. Minutes passed. Jonathan stood there, his posture unwavering, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had come to this company with the intention of forging a partnership that would take his own business to the next level. Instead, he found himself in a standoff, facing systemic issues far deeper than he had ever imagined. He began to realize that this confrontation wasn't just about him. It was about everything he had worked for, about everything he had fought for in his own life. This was about respect, dignity, and making sure no one else would have to go through what he was enduring. Finally, the door to the elevator opened with a soft chime, and out stepped a tall man in his mid-50s, wearing a tailored suit. His expression was stern, but as he walked toward Jonathan, there was a slight change in his demeanor, a subtle hint of nervousness behind his composed facade. He was the CEO of the company, Jonathan's intended meeting partner, and from the way he was looking at Jonathan, it was clear that the receptionist's phone call had already alerted him to what had happened. "Mr. Mitchell," the CEO greeted him, extending his hand, but his voice was hesitant. "I'm Thomas Warner, CEO of this company. I apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced today. Let's step into my office and discuss this matter." Jonathan shook his hand, but his grip was firm, deliberate. He didn't move right away. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Warner's. "I'm not going anywhere until we've addressed this issue right here," Jonathan said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of experience. "You may be the CEO of this company, but you should know that this is not just about a misunderstanding or some small oversight. This is about the culture you've allowed to exist here, a culture where people like me, people who have worked their whole lives to get to where they are treated like we don't belong. Your receptionist didn't just fail to recognize me. She failed to treat me with basic human respect." Warner's expression shifted, a slight flicker of realization passing through his eyes. For a moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Jonathan's words hung in the air, demanding an answer, demanding accountability. I had no idea this was happening," Warner said, finally speaking, his voice quieter than before. "I'm deeply sorry for what you've experienced. But please understand, this isn't the norm for our company. I'll make sure that this is dealt with immediately." Jonathan didn't move. "It's not just about the receptionist. It's about the system, about the unspoken biases that exist in every corner of this place. How many others have been treated like this? How many others have been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel less than they are? It's time for real change." Warner took a deep breath, his eyes darkening with the weight of the conversation. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low but resolute. "This is a wake-up call for us. I've been so focused on the business side of things that I've allowed things like this to slip through the cracks. But that ends now. You have my word." For a long moment, there was silence. Jonathan didn't need any more empty promises. He didn't need to hear the CEO's words. He needed to see action, and he could sense that Warner understood this, that he was beginning to see the severity of what had happened. Jonathan finally nodded, a sense of resolution in his eyes. "Good. I'm glad to hear that. But it's not enough to just promise change. You need to make it happen, and you need to hold people accountable, not just the receptionist, but everyone who fosters this environment. If you don't, the next time someone like me walks through that door, they'll face the same treatment. It has to end here." Warner swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "I will make sure this company changes. We will implement new training, new policies, and create a zero-tolerance environment for discrimination in any form. I will personally oversee it." Jonathan was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. This was the moment of truth. He had made his point, and now it was up to Warner to follow through. This could be the beginning of something better, or it could be another empty promise lost to the winds. "Good," Jonathan said at last. "I'll be watching, and I'll be back to see how things are progressing. Until then, I expect nothing but the best from your company." As he turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the situation lifted from his shoulders. He had come here to build a business relationship, but what he was leaving with was so much more. He had not only stood up for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and devalued. In that moment, Jonathan had done what no one else had been willing to do. He had forced change. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Jonathan Mitchell walked out of that office, knowing he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who would follow.